You heard him. This is NBA Today. Welcome back. And now I am joined by NBA Commissioner Adam Silver. Thank you so much for being here, Commissioner.
Thanks for having me, and congratulations on the new show.
Well, thank you so much. So I'm just going to dive right in, Commissioner. Ben Simmons, he was suspended for the season opener by the 76ers. What feedback have you been getting from teams and from owners as this trend of star players signing a contract and then deciding to simply not participate or do the bare minimum when they want out? What are you hearing from teams and owners on that?
I think it depends on the longevity of the team, personnel, or owner in the league. I mean, for those who've been at this a long time, as I have, this is nothing new, frankly, in the league, unfortunately. I mean, there's storied players over many decades who've held out of contracts, didn't go to the team that drafted them, held out of training camp, etc. So I don't really see it as being sort of the modern day issue many people are painting it to be. On the other hand, it's something you never like to see as a league. That, I think for Ben, I think what people are suggesting is that this early in his contract, it's highly unusual to be holding out in the way he is. But again, both sides have rights. As a result of holding out, he's some combination of not being paid and being fined on top of that. And so it's an unfortunate situation. And obviously there's a reason why we have contracts in this league. If everybody just complied according to handshakes, you wouldn't need those documents. And so then when you have situations like this, people of course turn to the contract and expect players to honor it from their standpoint, and players expect teams to honor contracts. And that's ultimate. And incidentally, just even watching your show earlier today and hearing from some of the players, it's not just about management or ownership versus the player. Players in this league, as you know, make moves based on where they think other players are going to be. And so there's a reliance issue for everyone involved and an expectation. It doesn't mean that behind the scenes, players and management don't have discussions about potentially moving. And of course, teams have the ability to trade players, but that's part of what they sign up for when they get their guaranteed contracts.
Commissioner, you mentioned contracts. So will you look to incorporate new player penalties to prevent situations like Simmons in the next collective bargaining agreement?
Whenever we sit down for a new collective bargaining agreement, both sides are always looking for new provisions to increase competitive balance in this league and to ensure that we have rules that make sense. But I'd only say, at the end of the day, everything can't necessarily be solved with collective bargaining language. I mean, for example, a player is always going to have the ability to withhold his services, and then a team is going to have the ability to not pay that player and potentially sanction that player. That's what's happening here. It's not clear to me, at least from my perspective, what provision would have avoided this. I mean, again, if a player is determined not to want to play in a particular market and is willing to accept the consequences, meaning he doesn't get paid and he gets fined on top of that, I guess somebody could argue that if we ratcheted up fines even more, that would force his hand. But even then, as we saw, he then showed up in training camp, and I'm just responding to reports I saw today, but then he clearly didn't want to be there and wasn't willing to listen to his coach, so here we're back at it again. So there isn't always, I would say, a simple solution. It's not as if we're sitting around the league office and saying, if we only had this provision in the CBA, that would avoid a player holdout. This is unfortunately been part of the league since the beginning of time. And actually, just as I said earlier, to put it in context, it's gotten much better in terms of the number of situations we have, like what's happening with Ben right now. There's far fewer than there used to be when I joined the league in the early 90s.
One other thing, Commissioner, that is going to continue, unfortunately, to be talked about because it is still an issue in our world is COVID-19. And you said yesterday that you think it would be best for everyone if every player was vaccinated. However, that mandate was a non-starter in your original negotiations with the NBPA. What room is there to go back to the negotiating table with the Players Association there?
My sense is there's not a lot of room to go back to the negotiating table. I mean, you could ask Michelle Roberts, the executive director of the Players Association, that. I think she would say particularly because when we began that negotiation, the players were somewhere in the low 80s in terms of percentage of players vaccinated. And now, even though we don't have a mandate, but there's separate protocols vaccinated players and unvaccinated players live under, we're at roughly 96% of our players are vaccinated, and that number even continues to tick up. Today, I saw there were a few additional players that became vaccinated. Something like 2/3 of our teams are fully vaccinated right now. But understandably, there's enormous attention focused on the few players who've chosen not to get vaccinated, particularly Kyrie, because he's such a high-profile all-star player. As I said, I wish that we had come to an agreement and everybody was required to get vaccinated. But I also think there's confusion around the Kyrie situation. That's not an adversarial situation between the league and the union or the league and the player. This is about a New York City rule that requires all people working or attending events in arenas to get vaccinated. So this is about a New York law that Kyrie is saying he's not willing to comply with. And the team has understandably said, well, you're either in or out. And I think my sense is that doesn't come just from management. As we said, just like with the prior issue, it's a team sport. Contracts, appearances affect everyone. And players are, even the best players in the league need other great players to win with. And so I'm hopeful still that Kyrie, as he gets a chance to absorb everything that's happening, he may not change his opinion about the vaccine, but may realize that in the best interest of his teammates, of the league, I very much believe in the best interest of his health and his family's health and his community's health, he should get vaccinated.
You also said yesterday, Commissioner, that the investigation into the possible tampering by the Chicago Bulls and their sign-and-trade deal with the New Orleans Pelicans for Lonzo Ball and the Miami Heat and their sign-and-trade deal for the Toronto Raptors star Kyle Lowry, you said that was ongoing. How important is it, though, to curb that behavior?
It's very important to curb that behavior because, again, all these issues seem related. That you need a rule of law in this league where everyone understands what the rules are. If the rules don't work in operation, then we need to sit down with our teams and the Players Association and change them. But these are the rules at this time. In the case of your question, in terms of player contact, and teams want to understand that if they abide by the rules, there will be a level playing field. And so it's in everyone's interest, all of the teams, all of the players, that we have a level playing field, just like the competition on the court behind me. Everybody wants to know that when they're rooting for their team or they're tuning into competition, that everything is decided fairly by the rules. In the case of the game, on the floor, in the case of player signings, fairly according to the collective bargaining agreement, and everybody's complying with those rules. And that's the league office's job. If there's a sense that there's something we need to look into or there's some aspect that's not being complied with, we investigate and look into it. And that's what's going on right now. Absolutely.
So very quickly, Commissioner, before I let you go, and I really appreciate the time, I'm hoping you can actually take off your commissioner's hat for just a second and help us celebrate the NBA's, there we go, the NBA's 75th anniversary. So who is your favorite player of all time to watch?
That's such an unfair question.
I know. Had to be a little unfair. Just pick one.
I'll pick one. I mean, it's not a secret. I grew up in New York, and I grew up a New York Knicks fan. And that 1973 team in particular is sort of when I was becoming of age. So I certainly remember that championship. I remember going to games with my father. I'd say a player that I was particularly fond of was Earl Monroe. And someone, in fact, that I'm still friendly with today. And most recently, I hope you talk about this on your show at some point, that 2 weeks ago, a group of New Yorkers led by someone named Dan Cloris opened up the Earl Monroe New Renaissance School in Bronx, New York. I was there with Michelle Roberts, the executive of the association. She's from the Bronx as well. And it's a school, believe it or not, focused on basketball, but not necessarily about future players, either NBA or WNBA, but focused on jobs like mine and yours as an opportunity for people who love the sport to find careers around it, whether it's being a broadcaster, whether it's working in marketing or sales at the league office, being a lawyer at the league office, being the commissioner one day. So I was there with Earl, he's and his wife Malika. They're fantastic people. And I just say I'm thrilled that, to be talking about Earl as one of my favorite players of all time.
Absolutely. Earl Monroe, thank you so much for taking the time, Commissioner, and enjoy the ring ceremony tonight.